Good evening, and welcome to tonight's gentle journey through the stars. Take a moment to settle in, perhaps pull your covers up just a bit closer, and let the day's worries drift away like ships departing into the vast darkness of space. Tonight, we'll be travelling together through Dan Simmons' remarkable tale, Hyperion, a story of 7 pilgrims on a rather extraordinary journey across the galaxy. Picture, if you will, a universe where humanity has spread across countless worlds, connected by shimmering portals and ancient mysteries. Our story begins with a solitary figure, the Hegemony Consul, sitting in his peaceful sanctuary on a distant, unnamed world. The evening breeze carries the scent of unfamiliar flowers through his dwelling as he contemplates a message that has just arrived from the very heart of human civilization. It's an invitation, or perhaps a summons, to join a pilgrimage to a world called Hyperion, where ancient structures called the Time Tombs are beginning to open after centuries of patient waiting. As we follow the Consul and his fellow travellers, we'll discover their stories, tales within tales, each one revealing why they've been chosen for this final pilgrimage. So close your eyes now, take a deep, calming breath, and let's begin our journey to Hyperion, where time flows strangely and mysteries older than humanity itself await in the shadows. Now we find ourselves drifting to a rather extraordinary moment, where the fate of an entire galaxy begins to shift on the balcony of a single spaceship. Picture, if you will, a sleek ebony vessel resting in the humid darkness of an unnamed world. The air hangs thick and heavy with approaching storms, while below in the primeval swamps, ancient creatures call out through the mist, their bellows echoing like memories from Earth's own distant past. The Hegemony Consul sits at his piano, a beautiful old Steinway that somehow makes this alien wilderness feel almost like home. His fingers move across the keys, bringing Rachmaninoff's haunting prelude to life, while lightning flickers on the northern horizon. There's something rather peaceful about this solitude he's carved out for himself. Just a man, his music, and a world that belongs to no one but the creatures that have called it home for millions of years. But peace, as we know, is often merely the pause between storms. The fatline receiver chimes, cutting through the symphony of thunder and distant roars, and with that simple sound, everything changes. The voice that comes through belongs to Mina Gladstone herself, that grand old leader of the Hegemony, whose weary tones carry the weight of terrible decisions. She brings news that would chill anyone's heart. The Consul has been chosen, selected by the mysterious Church of the Shrike to join a pilgrimage to Hyperion. Not just any pilgrimage, mind you, but perhaps the last one that will ever be permitted. The Time Tombs, those impossible structures that move backward through time, are opening. The Shrike, that creature of thorns and steel and nightmare, has begun to range far from its ancient prison. And if that weren't troubling enough, an ouster migration cluster approaches, 4,000 units strong, like a dark tide rolling through the cosmos toward Hyperion. The mathematics of disaster are rather simple: an evacuation fleet racing to save Hegemony citizens, an invasion force approaching, and somewhere among the 7 chosen pilgrims, a spy whose allegiance lies with the enemy. The Consul listens to all of this while storm winds begin to shake his ship. He learns that Sol Weintraub and Fedman Kassad are among his fellow pilgrims, names that clearly carry meaning, though we don't yet know what shadows they bring with them. As the transmission fades and night truly falls, the Consul stands alone with his decision. He thinks about the morning hunt he'd planned in the fern forests, the simple pleasure of solitude he's earned through past suffering. He remembers Hyperion, the gleam of ice crystals near the Time Tombs, the terrible beauty of the Shrike's Tree of Thorns, the screams that echo in memory. And as dawn approaches with another storm, as the giant trees bend before winds that could flatten cities, the Consul makes his choice. His ebony ship rises on a tail of blue flame, pushing through the clouds toward the stars, toward rendezvous, toward a destiny that waits on a world where time itself has gone mad. Now, let us drift gently into the next part of our story, where the great tree ship Yggdrasil carries our 7 pilgrims through the star-filled darkness toward their destiny. Picture, if you will, the Consul awakening from that peculiar slumber that only cryogenic sleep can bring. That strange, dreamless void where months pass in what feels like a single heartbeat. He finds himself in a small, egg-shaped room, its walls translucent and glowing softly with filtered starlight. The floor beneath him is carpeted with dark grass. Yes, actual grass, growing within this living ship. Hegemony, the tall, hooded Templar captain, stands waiting with the traditional glass of orange juice that helps ease the transition back to waking life. The Consul's throat is parched, his head swimming with that distinctive post-fugue disorientation that makes the world feel both too real and not quite real enough. As he dresses in his evening wear, loose black trousers, a flowing white silk shirt, and that distinctive tricorn hat, the Consul follows Hegemony up through the magnificent architecture of the tree ship. Imagine walking along pathways that spiral around the massive trunk of this kilometre-long tree, with no railings between you and a 600-metre drop into the glowing depths below. The entire ship pulses with life, its leaves rustling to unfelt breezes, glowbirds nestled like Japanese lanterns among the branches. They arrive at the captain's dining platform, where our other pilgrims have already gathered around a long wooden table. Above them, the stars burn in their millions, not the few thousand visible from a planet's surface, but an entire galaxy's worth, rotating slowly as the tree ship adjusts its course through the void. And here, at this table suspended between the stars, Father Leonard Hoyt rises to tell the first tale. The young priest looks terribly ill, his face gaunt and drawn with some hidden pain. He places 2 small charred journals on the table, notebooks that look as though they've survived a fire. These, he explains in his weary voice, belong to another priest, Father Paul Duret, whose story he must tell to explain his own presence on this pilgrimage. So begins a tale within a tale, as Father Hoyt transports us back to his younger days, when he was chosen to escort the brilliant but disgraced Jesuit, Paul Duret, into exile on Hyperion. Picture young Hoyt, fresh from seminary, filled with that bright-eyed faith that hasn't yet been tested by the world's harsh realities. And beside him, the older priest, tall, ascetic, with piercing eyes that held both wisdom and a terrible secret. Their journey takes them aboard an aging spaceship called the Nadia Oleg, a grimy metal vessel with no windows, no gravity, and nothing to do during the long months of travel but float in zero-G hammocks and contemplate their destination. Father Duret reveals his intention to study the mysterious Bakura, a legendary tribe said to live in the most inhospitable region of Hyperion's southern continent. Through Father Duret's journal entries, which Hoyt reads to the assembled pilgrims, we follow the older priest's journey into the heart of darkness. First to Keats, Hyperion's ramshackle capital, where he discovers an abandoned cathedral, its broken towers reaching toward the green-tinged sky like the fingers of a buried giant. In this ruined holy place, while attempting to perform a solitary mass, he encounters a mysterious blind woman who lights a single red candle before vanishing into the shadows. Then southward by dirigible, a massive cargo vessel drifting slowly over endless seas that glow with an unhealthy phosphorescence at night. Picture Father Duret standing on the observation deck as the sun sets, watching strange creatures with metre-wide gossamer wings hover in the salt-tinged air before diving toward the luminous waters below. He writes in his journal of his loneliness, his crisis of faith, his growing sense that the church itself is dying like an old tree rotting from within. Port Romance comes next, a squalid city built on stilts over tidal mud flats, where violence and death are as common as the morning rain. Father Duret witnesses 3 deaths in his first week, a bloated corpse washed up on the shore, a man burned beyond recognition in a fire, and most disturbing of all, a stranger shot dead just meters away from him. As the dying man breathes his last, Father Duret performs the last rites, and we sense his desperate need to find meaning in these senseless deaths. The journey continues upriver on a decrepit boat called the Emperotic Girandole, chugging slowly through jungle so dense it forms a green tunnel overhead. The air grows thick and heavy with moisture. Rain pounds down each afternoon with such violence it seems the very sky is falling. At night, the jungle glows with bioluminescent decay, and meteor showers weave the stars together with threads of light. At Pericebo Plantation, disaster strikes. Father Dure falls desperately ill with fever, his journal entries becoming fragmented and delirious. A woman with dark, gentle eyes cares for him through days of delirium and nights of burning fever. His writings during this time are confused, frightening, filled with paranoid imaginings and feverish visions. And here, as Father Hoyt pauses in his reading, we're left suspended in uncertainty. What will become of Father Dure? How does his quest for the mysterious Bakura connect to Father Hoyt's own presence on this pilgrimage? The young priest's drawn face suggests that darker revelations are yet to come. The dining platform remains lit by starlight as our pilgrims lean forward, drawn into this tale of faith and fever, of mysterious tribes and abandoned cathedrals. Below them, Hyperion grows larger, its surface beginning to show the first hints of continents and seas. The story has only just begun, and already we sense that each tale will weave into the others, creating a tapestry of destiny that binds these seven souls together. Rest now, and let these images settle gently in your mind. The glowing tree ship sailing through stars, the abandoned cathedral with its single red candle, the fever dreams of a priest far from home, seeking truth in the most forsaken corners of the galaxy. Now then, let us return to Father Dure's extraordinary journey into the heart of Hyperion's mysteries. When we last left him, he was recovering from a terrible fever at Pericebo Plantation, nursed back to health by the gentle Sempha. Picture him now, 10 days later, finally strong enough to continue his quest for the legendary Bakura. His guide, a cheerful fellow named Tuk, leads him away from the safety of the plantation and up into the wild heights of the Pinion Plateau. Through yellow rainforests they climb, their pack-brids laden with supplies, ascending ever higher through dense stands of mutated pines and peculiar trees called triaspen. The air grows thin and cold. After a week of exhausting travel, they emerge onto a rocky outcrop 3,000 meters above sea level, where they can look back across an endless carpet of clouds pierced here and there by glimpses of the chrome-yellow forest below. And then, my dear listeners, they enter the flame forests, those legendary groves where death dances on branches of living electricity. Picture these extraordinary Tesla trees, towering 100 meters tall, their crowns bulging with great onion-shaped domes that store electrical energy. Silver vines trail from their branches like tinsel on some impossibly tall Christmas tree. The air itself smells of ozone and danger. Tuk insists they change immediately into their protective gear, thick leather suits called gamma cloth, heavy rubber boots, and special breathing masks. Even their pack-brids grow nervous, their long ears twitching at every sound. As darkness falls, they set up camp within a protective circle of arrestor rods, slender metal stakes that can deflect the deadly lightning that will soon come. And come it does. At midnight, the world explodes into light and thunder. The Tesla trees begin their terrifying display, releasing arcs of blue-white electricity that leap from tree to tree, setting the forest ablaze. Poor Father Dure watches in awe and terror as a tree mere meters from their camp explodes in flames. Their arrestor rods glow white-hot, hissing and sparking as they deflect bolt after bolt of lightning. In a moment of pure horror, one of their pack-brids breaks free and runs beyond the protective circle. Instantly, the poor creature is struck by half a dozen lightning bolts. For just a heartbeat, Father Dure can see its skeleton glowing through its flesh before it simply ceases to exist. For 3 endless hours, they huddle in their small tent while the world burns around them. The arrestor rods begin to fail, one by one, and Tuk grimly informs the priest that when they're gone, they will die. But somehow, miraculously, 8 rods hold until dawn, and our weary travellers emerge from the inferno, stumbling through a landscape of ash and rebirth, where seed pods burst open with new life, even as the old forest smoulders. At last, exhausted beyond measure, they reach the edge of the great cleft, that massive canyon carved into Hyperion's ancient crust. Picture Father Dure standing at the edge of this chasm, 3 kilometers deep, listening to waterfalls tumble into mist far below. As evening approaches, the most extraordinary sound rises from the depths, a symphony of wind through stone that creates notes ranging from the deepest bass to the highest soprano, as if the planet itself is singing. It's here, camped at the edge of this singing abyss, that tragedy strikes. Father Dure wakes at sunrise to find poor Tuk lying dead, his throat cut while he slept. The priest hadn't heard a sound, though he'd dreamed of cool hands touching his neck, touching the crucifix he wears. In his panic and grief, he buries his guide and moves his camp, clutching a machete and an old hunting weapon, scanning the mists for any sign of the murderers. Days pass in fearful solitude before they finally appear, the Bikura. Picture them now, 60 or 70 small figures in rough brown robes, completely bald, their faces smooth and strangely ageless. They approach Father Dure in perfect silence, surrounding him in a semicircle. When they speak, it's in a corrupted form of ancient English. "You are the one who belongs to the cruciform," they say, and to his amazement, they all drop to one knee in perfect unison, as if genuflecting before an altar. They lead him to their village, a collection of crude stone huts perched on ledges along the cleft's edge. Father Dure discovers these people call themselves the 70, always maintaining exactly 70 members, the same number as the colonists who crashed here 4 centuries ago. They have no individual names, no concept of time, no children visible anywhere. When he asks why they killed Tuk, their answers are maddeningly circular. They killed him to make him die. He died because he was killed. Each evening at sunset, the entire tribe descends the cliff face, clinging to ancient vines, disappearing beneath an overhang. When Father Dure tries to follow, they gently but firmly turn him back, warning that if he attempts it again, they will cut his throat as they did Tuk's. But our determined priest cannot resist the mystery. When the Bikura go foraging in the forest, he lowers himself over the cliff edge, clinging desperately to those swaying vines, with 3,000 meters of empty air beneath his feet. What he discovers there changes everything. Beneath the overhang, carved directly into the cliff face, stands an ancient basilica, a temple of impossible age. Its entrance is flanked by towering windows of strange, coloured stone that seems to glow with inner light. Inside, he finds a vast hall carved from solid rock, larger even than St. Peter's Basilica on Pacum. And at its centre, on a raised altar, stands a cross, 4 meters tall, 3 meters wide, encrusted with diamonds, sapphires, and precious stones that catch and hold the light of the setting sun. This basilica, this impossible structure, has stood here for tens of thousands of years, long before humanity left old Earth, perhaps even before Christ walked in Galilee. Father Dure kneels and prays, overwhelmed by what he's discovered. He's found proof of something divine, something that predates human presence on this world. But when he returns to the surface, his violation of the Bikura's taboo is discovered. They strip him, searching his body for something they call the cruciform. Finding nothing, they declare he must die the true death. Only his desperate claim that he's been to their altar, that he follows the cross, saves him from immediate execution. For 3 days they imprison him while debating his fate. Then, in an act that breaks his heart, they burn all his equipment, his camera, his notes, his recordings, everything that could have proven his miraculous discovery to the outside world. As the sun sets and the winds begin their nightly song, they lead him back down to the basilica. There, in that ancient hall bathed in the coloured light of sunset streaming through those mysterious windows, with the cross glowing as if lit from within, Father Dure stands with the 70 in a circle of silence. The wind music rises to a deafening crescendo, the light deepens from amber to gold to lapis blue, and the great crucifix seems to absorb and radiate this light directly into their waiting forms. And here, dear listeners, we pause, for something profound is about to happen to Father Paul Duret, something that will transform him forever. Rest now, and let these images settle gently into your dreams. The ancient basilica hidden in the cliff, the glowing cross that predates human history, and our solitary priest standing at the threshold of an impossible mystery. And so we return to Father Duret's tale, dear listeners, as he descends once more into the depths of the cleft with the Bikura. Picture him now, clutching at smooth stone walls in the darkness, following the bobbing torchlight down that ancient staircase, carved directly into the cliff face. 300 meters below, the river roars with such violence that he can feel its vibrations through the stone itself. Each step on those age-worn slabs feels treacherous, slick with centuries of moisture and time. As they descend through the night, imagine the stars wheeling overhead through that narrow slice of sky. Father Duret recites his rosary. The familiar words a lifeline in this alien darkness. Hour after hour they spiral downward, until at last, as dawn approaches, they reach the base of the cleft itself. And there, carved into the opposing cliff wall, stands something that changes everything. A perfect square of darkness, 30 meters to a side. An entrance to one of Hyperion's legendary labyrinths. Now, you must understand the significance of this discovery. Only 9 worlds in all the known universe possess these ancient tunnels, carved 750,000 years ago by builders whose identity remains one of humanity's greatest mysteries. The tunnels run for hundreds of thousands of kilometers beneath the planet's crust, perfectly smooth, perfectly empty, their purpose utterly unknown. Father Duret follows the Bikura into this ancient passage where something extraordinary happens. As Beta extinguishes his torch, the darkness should be absolute. But instead, a soft, rose-coloured glow begins to emanate from the walls themselves. The entire tunnel is encrusted with thousands upon thousands of glowing crosses, ranging from tiny specks to forms nearly a metre wide. Each pulses with its own organic light, warm to the touch, clearly alive. These mysterious organisms the Bikura call cruciforms. And then, in this cathedral of pink light, something enters the chamber. The Bikura drop to their knees, but Father Duret remains standing, transfixed by what he sees. The creature towers 3 meters tall, its surface flowing like liquid mercury, its body bristling with blades and thorns. 4 arms extend with fingers like surgical instruments. Where eyes should be, multifaceted gems burn with their own internal fire. This is the Shrike, the Lord of Pain, the creature of legend that haunts Hyperion's time tombs. For one terrible, beautiful moment, the Shrike embraces Father Duret in a cage of blades and chrome. The priest feels something profound, not fear, but almost religious ecstasy, as if confronting a demon somehow affirms the existence of the divine. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the creature vanishes, leaving no trace. The Bikura perform their ritual then, placing one of the smaller cruciforms around Father Duret's neck. It feels cool against his skin at first, just a simple cross on a cord. But when he returns to the surface and tries to remove it, he makes a horrifying discovery. The organism has fused with his flesh, become part of his very body. The med scanner reveals the terrible truth. Root-like filaments spreading throughout his system, wrapping around his organs, infiltrating his brain. As the days pass, Father Duret makes other discoveries about his captors. The Bikura are not merely simple, they are incomplete. Every one of them is sexless, neither male nor female, but smooth and featureless as dolls. When one named Alpha falls from a cliff and dies, his skull shattered, his body broken beyond any possibility of survival, the Bikura carry him to the basilica. There, over 3 days, Father Duret watches in horror as the cruciform resurrects the corpse, rebuilding it cell by cell. But what returns is less than what died, duller, slower, with the vacant smile of a flow-foam doll. The cruciform grants immortality, but at a terrible price. Each death and resurrection strips away more humanity, more intelligence, more soul. The Bakura have been dying and returning for centuries, becoming less themselves with each cycle. And now Father Dure carries this same parasite within him. He tries desperately to escape, but the cruciform won't let him leave. When he ventures too far from the cleft, agony strikes, pain so intense it drives him back like an invisible leash. He's trapped in this small valley, building a chapel stone by stone while searching for any means of true escape. Finally, Father Dure conceives a desperate plan. If the cruciform feeds on its host, resurrecting them to avoid the pain of death, then perhaps sustained, continuous pain might drive it away. He takes the arrestor rods, those devices that protect against the Tesla tree's lightning, and uses them for an unthinkable purpose. His final journal entry speaks of sunset light through his chapel window, of making peace with God, of choosing true death over false immortality. And there, dear listeners, the journal ends. Rest now, as we prepare to hear what Father Hoyt discovered when he arrived on Hyperion, 8 long years after Paul Dure disappeared into the flame forests. And so we drift now to Colonel Fedman Kassad, as he begins his tale aboard the ancient barge Benares. The morning has grown warm and bright, with Hyperion's sun casting dancing patterns across the green waters of the Huli. You can almost feel the gentle rocking of the deck beneath their feet, hear the soft creaking of ancient wood that has carried passengers for centuries uncounted. Kassad stands at the railing, this tall soldier who seems carved from shadow and silence, and he tells them of a moment that changed everything. Not in the recent wars, not in the battles that made him famous throughout the web. No, he takes them back to something far stranger, to a training simulation at the Olympus Command School on Mars, where young cadets learn the art of war through history itself. Picture, if you will, a dreary October morning in the year 1415. The rain has just stopped falling on a muddy field in northern France, and 7,000 English soldiers face nearly 30,000 French. This is Agincourt, one of history's most famous battles, and young Kassad finds himself there, not watching, but living it. The historical tactical network doesn't merely show you history, it lets you breathe it, feel it, become part of it. He's an English archer, cold and tired and frightfully hungry. The simulation is so perfect that he can feel the damp seeping through his rough clothes, smell the wet earth and the nervous sweat of the men around him. His stomach churns from the berries that have been his only food for days. The longbow in his hands weighs heavy, and he has 48 arrows planted in the mud at his feet. The morning stretches on with terrible tension. The French cavalry sits there in their gleaming armour, their horses pawing the ground, but they don't charge. The waiting becomes almost unbearable, like a held breath that goes on far too long. Then, finally, King Henry gives the order, and thousands of arrows rise into the grey sky like a flock of deadly birds, hanging for just a moment before raining down upon the French. What follows is the controlled chaos of medieval warfare. The French cavalry charges at last, and Kassad experiences something no amount of training could have prepared him for. The sight of 1,200 armoured horses thundering directly toward him. The ground itself seems to shake, and for those 40 seconds of the charge, time stretches and contracts in the strangest way. But the stakes the archers have driven into the ground do their work. Horses refuse to impale themselves, riders tumble into the mud, and suddenly Kassad is in the thick of a hand-to-hand combat, wielding mallet and knife with desperate efficiency. It's brutal and muddy, and nothing like the clean kills of modern warfare. Then something extraordinary happens. A French knight escapes into the woods, and Kassad, caught up in the bloodlust of battle, pursues him. Deep in the autumn forest, with leaves thick on the ground and the sounds of battle muffled by distance, Kassad corners his quarry. The knight turns to fight, his sword swinging in deadly arcs. And then she appears. She comes out of nowhere, this woman with short brown hair and eyes as deep as starlight. She strikes the knight with Kassad's dropped mallet, and together they fight with perfect synchronization as if they've trained together for years. When the Frenchman finally falls still, they collapse beside each other, gasping for breath in the sudden quiet of the forest. Cassad looks at her, and time seems to stop. She's tall for that era, dressed like him in rough archer's clothes, but there's something about her that doesn't belong to the 15th century at all. Her bone structure is too perfect, her eyes too knowing. She's perhaps the most beautiful woman he's ever seen, but it's more than beauty that captures him. It's a sense of recognition, as if he's been waiting his whole life to meet her. What happens next is as inevitable as the tide. Without words, without explanation, they come together there in the forest. The October light filters through bare branches, painting everything in gold and amber. The carpet of leaves beneath them rustles softly, and for those few perfect minutes, the battle, the simulation, the entire universe falls away. There's only the two of them, moving together in ancient rhythm while the world holds its breath. When Cassad opens his eyes, she's gone. The sun has set, the forest has grown cold and dark, and he's alone with the cooling corpse of the French knight. He stumbles back to the battlefield in a daze, but when the simulation ends and he's helped from his training pod, no one else has noticed anything unusual. The instructors insist that nothing exists beyond the battlefield in that simulation segment. The forest where Cassad fought and loved doesn't exist in their records, but Cassad knows better. He knows she was real. She comes to him again and again through his years at the command school. In the steaming jungles of Vietnam, she appears in black pajamas, fighting beside him in the green glow of flare light. At Gettysburg, she finds him among the powder smoke and carnage. At Borodino, where the dead pile up like cordwood. In the shattered ruins of Brasilia and on the Russian steppes. Each time they meet, they make love with desperate passion, as if trying to compress a lifetime into moments. He begs her for her name, asks if she's real outside the simulations, pleads to stay with her or have her join him in the real world. She answers only with touches and smiles, appearing and disappearing like a dream that refuses to fade with morning. Cassad calls her mystery, and she becomes his secret obsession. While other young officers seek companionship in the towns near their bases, Cassad takes long, solitary walks or loses himself in history books. His dedication to duty becomes legendary, but underneath it all, he's simply a man in love with a phantom. You see, this is how Cassad's life splits in two. The outer life of a brilliant young soldier rising through the ranks, and the inner life where he waits for his next glimpse of mystery. He carries the memory of her like a hidden flame, the small mole under her left breast, the way she brushes her hair back impatiently, the particular arch of her back when she rises above him. And so Colonel Cassad's tale begins, not with his famous victories or his rise from the Martian slums to become one of Force's most decorated officers. It begins with a love that shouldn't exist, in a place that supposedly never was, with a woman who appears only in humanity's moments of greatest violence. But, as our pilgrims listen on the sunny deck of the Benares, watching the Hyperion countryside slide peacefully past, they begin to understand that Cassad's mystery woman is somehow connected to their pilgrimage, to the time tombs, and perhaps to the Shrike itself. The river continues its ancient course, carrying them ever closer to their destination, while overhead the sky remains brilliantly, deceptively calm. And so we drift deeper into Colonel Cassad's remarkable tale, where the boundaries between honor and survival begin to blur like heat mirages across desert sand. Let me tell you what happened next in his extraordinary journey, as our pilgrims continue to listen aboard the gentle, swaying Benares. You see, after those haunting encounters with his mysterious woman in the simulation battles, Cassad's military career took him to places where the old codes of warfare would be tested beyond breaking. Picture, if you will, the colony world of Comriard, where 30 million religious zealots rose up against the peaceful inhabitants. The situation was quite desperate. The Hegemony ship's captain and officers had been taken prisoner, and young Captain Cassad found himself the ranking officer, tasked with an impossible mission. What he did there would echo through history. In a moment of calculated precision, he landed a single assault boat in the grand courtyard of the Great Mosque. Imagine the scene. One small craft, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of militants, held back only by its shimmering containment field. Cassad gave them 3 hours to surrender. When they refused, when the new prophet continued his televised threats against the hostages, well, that's when Cassad demonstrated a terrible new form of warfare. At precisely the appointed hour, orbital satellites focused their ancient weapons with surgical precision. In a single instant, over 15,000 revolutionary leaders simply ceased to be. The effect was as immediate as it was horrifying. The revolution collapsed like a house of cards in a gentle breeze. That night, as Cassad rested in orbit, she came to him again, his mystery woman. Not in a simulation this time, but in something deeper than dreams. She tried to speak to him beneath a canopy of stars, her lips forming words just below the threshold of hearing. But when he moved to see her better, the contact was lost, leaving him alone with tears on his cheeks. But Comriard was merely a prelude to the horror that would come at South Brescia. Let me paint you a picture of this catastrophe, where everything the military had believed about honourable warfare would crumble like ancient parchment. The ousters, those mysterious barbarians from the darkness between stars, fell upon Brescia without warning. They destroyed the world's defences in mere hours, then did something everyone thought impossible. They invaded. Picture these strange, elongated beings in their powered armour, swarming across the continents like metallic spiders. The mathematics were simple and terrible. 80,000 force troops against an endless tide of ouster warriors. What followed was warfare stripped of all pretense and honour. Gone were the careful, controlled battles of the new Bushido. This was something older, more primitive. Urban combat through ruined cities, fighting over the bodies of civilians. Cassad understood this change instinctively. While other commanders froze in confusion, he adapted, trading lives for time, calling for weapons that hadn't been used in centuries. Through those 97 days of hell, she came to him in visions more real than reality itself. In the tunnels beneath Stoneheap, where Cassad hunted ouster commandos with gas and sonics, he felt her fingers on his cheek, the warmth of her presence in that underground darkness. When they entered the ruins of New Vienna, walking past rows of severed heads lined up like a macabre greeting, he retreated to his command vehicle and heard her whispers through the static of military channels. On the final night before the ouster retreat, Cassad watched the bombardment from a hilltop. Hundreds of nuclear flowers blooming across the plateau in perfect geometric patterns. And there, walking between the dead plants on the hillside, she appeared in a pale blue dress. The wind lifted the hem of her garment like a departing ghost. She called his name, he could almost hear it, before the second wave of explosions washed everything away in light and thunder. The irony of war, as Cassad discovered, is particularly cruel. He survived 97 days of the worst combat the Hegemony had ever witnessed, only to be wounded by a hidden bomb 2 days after the last ouster fled. The building collapsed upon him like a closing fist. They put him on a hospital ship for the slow journey home, letting time and medical technology work their patient magic. But the journey would take an unexpected turn. The ship was attacked, lanced by ouster weapons with terrible efficiency. Cassad awoke to chaos, decompression, death, the ship torn to pieces around him. What followed was a desperate ballet of survival. Through the wreckage he moved, finding a dead marine suit, watching corpses float in their own small galaxies of blood. The ship had been shattered like a child's toy, but Cassad found an ouster boarding craft, a squid they called them, and through cunning and desperation he took it. The battle that followed was brief and vicious. Using surgical lasers as weapons, fighting in zero gravity with a failing suit, Cassad somehow prevailed, but his stolen craft was not meant for atmospheric entry. As it burned through the sky of the planet below, Cassad found the ancient ejection system, a relic from humanity's earliest spaceflights, and pulled the release. He descended, as she would later tell him, under a wing of golden foil. When he awoke, there she was, real at last, bending over him with cool fingers on his cheek. She told him her name, Moneta. They were in the dead city of poets on Hyperion, and beyond the hills lay the time tombs. What happened next defies easy explanation. They prepared themselves with strange, mirror-like fields that turned their bodies to flowing chrome. The Shrike appeared, that legendary creature of thorns and blades with its 1,000-faceted eyes burning red in the morning light. Together, the three of them moved through frozen time to where the ouster forces waited. And there, in that moment suspended between heartbeats, Cassad faced a terrible choice about honor, survival, and what it means to be human in the face of incomprehensible power. And so, we come to the most disturbing part of Colonel Cassad's tale, where violence and desire become impossibly intertwined on that battlefield beneath Hyperion's copper sky. Picture, if you will, the aftermath of that terrible dance through time, bodies scattered like fallen leaves across the scorched earth, the assault boats burning in the distance, sending ribbons of black smoke into the morning air. What happened next defies easy explanation, even in the telling. The bloodlust of battle transformed into something else entirely between Cassad and this mysterious Moneta. There, among the fallen, their chrome-like protective fields dissolved, leaving them both human again, or at least appearing so. The heat of combat became a different kind of heat altogether, drawing them together with a magnetic pull that Cassad could not resist. But this union was no tender moment of connection. It was something darker, more primal, happening there in that field of death, with the smell of ozone and burnt metal still hanging in the air. And as their passion reached its peak, Moneta revealed her true nature in the most horrifying way imaginable. Imagine Cassad's terror as the woman beneath him began to change, her soft flesh transforming into cold metal, her mouth filling with steel blades where teeth should be, her body becoming a trap designed to consume him entirely. In that moment of ultimate vulnerability, she became something monstrous, something that fed on destruction itself, the sound of metal clicking shut, missing him by the narrowest of margins as he tore himself away, leaving strips of his own flesh behind in his desperate escape. He fled across that battlefield, naked and bleeding, running from what he had thought was his destiny. Behind him, Moneta rose, no longer the woman from his dreams, but something caught between human and machine, with rows of metal teeth glinting in the sunlight, and eyes that burned with an unholy fire. 2 days later, the Hyperion Defense Forces found him unconscious on the grassy moors near Kronos Keep, 20 kilometers from where his escape pod had crashed. His body bore terrible wounds, and his mind had retreated somewhere deep inside itself, claiming no memory of what had transpired after he'd stolen the oustercraft. Now, as the morning light played across the waters of the Huli River, the other pilgrims sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd heard. The implications were staggering, the time tombs moving backward through time, Moneta existing in reverse chronology to their own timeline, and most disturbing of all, Cassad's vision of the Shrike's Tree of Thorns. When pressed, he admitted the terrible truth. He had seen at least one of their group impaled on those metal branches, victims from a future that hadn't happened yet. But he would not say who. Some knowledge perhaps is too heavy to share. As Cassad disappeared below deck, his final words hung in the warm air like a promise or a curse. He would make no petition to the Shrike. He would ask for nothing. When he met Moneta again, he intended to kill her. And so, we continue our journey with the pilgrims, dear listener, as their barge drifts into what remains of the river port of Naiad. Picture, if you will, the gentle splash of water against the hull as they approach, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across a scene of utter devastation, where once a thriving city of 20,000 souls had bustled with life, now only smouldering ruins greet our weary travellers. The famous Riverfront Inn, that grand establishment built in the days of sad King Billy himself, has been reduced to blackened foundations, its celebrated screened balconies collapsed into the shallows of the Huli River. The air carries the acrid scent of charred wood and something else, perhaps the lingering essence of violence itself. The pilgrims stand at the rail, each processing this destruction in their own way, wondering whether it was the Shrike's terrible work or perhaps the desperate defense forces, fighting against something they could never hope to understand. Martin Silenus, Our poet, whose tale we're about to hear, curses at the sight. The manta-holding pens lie open and useless, their great aquatic beasts gone. Without fresh mantas to pull their barge, the journey to Edge will stretch far longer than planned. The android Betic explains, with that particular calm that only artificial beings possess, that they must push their exhausted creatures beyond their limits. Perhaps they'll arrive by afternoon tomorrow, if fortune smiles upon them. As the barge continues northeast from the ruins, the landscape transforms around them. The forests and cultivated lands of the lower Huli gradually give way to endless orange prairie that rolls like frozen waves toward the distant sea of grass. In the fading light, you can imagine the way those grasses whisper and sigh, creating their own peculiar music. The mud towers of architect ants rise like ancient monuments, some reaching 30 feet into the air, their serrated structures catching the last rays of sunlight. Night falls with that particular stillness that only comes to wild places. The surface of the Huli becomes a perfect mirror, reflecting the grey-green twilight sky until fish break the surface in their evening feeding, sending ripples across that liquid glass. And then, as true darkness embraces the world, the prairie gossamers emerge, those luminescent spirits of the grasslands, their pale wings spanning wider than their forest cousins, dancing like ghost children in the valleys between the gentle hills. The pilgrims gather on the aft deck for dinner, lanterns casting warm pools of light as the stars emerge above them. And now, it's Martin Silenus' turn to share his story. This poet who has been drinking steadily since morning, his sharp features flushed but his voice carefully controlled. He begins, as all writers must, with words themselves. He speaks of how literature died when the word processor arrived, how thought processes followed, and how true creative expression withered in the face of technology. But his real story, the one that matters, starts much earlier, on old Earth itself, that lost paradise our species destroyed. Imagine, if you can, being born into the twilight of a dying world. Martin describes his childhood home with the loving detail of one who has lost everything, an estate of 1,000 acres, centered in 1,000,000 more. The lawns stretched like small prairies, the grass so perfect it seemed to beckon one to lie upon it and dream. Ancient trees made sundials with their shadows, royal oaks and giant elms, cottonwoods and cypress, all arranged in careful harmony. The house itself rose on a gentle hill, centuries of additions creating a magnificent puzzle of architecture. A jade tower caught the first light of dawn, gables threw triangular shadows across crystal conservatories at tea time, and balconies created elaborate games with afternoon light. This was after the big mistake, you understand, when the Kiev team's black hole was slowly devouring Earth from within. But during those periods of remission between planetary spasms, life continued with an almost desperate normalcy. Martin's mother glides through his memories like a ghost in white, pouring tea in dusty conservatories, her hair done up in the old style, infinitely refined and infinitely distant. His education came from an ancient tutor named Balthazar, a man so old he glowed blue-white from primitive life extension treatments. Under this peculiar mentor's guidance, Martin learned the classics, memorizing entire epics, composing complex verse forms before he could properly dress himself. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn, dear listener. When Earth finally died, Martin's mother saved him through an act of calculated cruelty. She sent him away on the slowest possible ship to a backwater world called Heaven's Gate, investing their remaining fortune in accounts she believed would accrue enough interest over the journey's century and a half to pay off family debts. The mother's calculations proved tragically wrong. Martin arrived at Heaven's Gate brain-damaged from the long freezing, his language centers destroyed, leaving him with a vocabulary of only 9 words, all of them crude, vulgar expressions of the basest human functions. Imagine a poet, a creature of words, reduced to grunting obscenities while labouring in poisonous mud pits beneath a dying brown sky. For 3 years he toiled in those sulphurous slime fields, his body breaking down, his new friends dying around him from the toxic atmosphere. Yet something remarkable happened in that hell. As his body laboured, his mind soared free, and slowly, painfully, like a blind man learning to see, the words began to return. He wrote his great work, his Cantos, on toilet paper by the light of a ghee lamp. Each word fought for and won back from the darkness. Then Fortune's wheel turned again. A violent encounter with a bully led to his rescue by a manager's wife named Helenda, who discovered his manuscript and saw its genius. Within weeks, his bastardized version of the Cantos, stripped of all philosophy and depth, retitled The Dying Earth, sold billions of copies across the web. Martin became wealthy beyond imagining, famous beyond enduring. The rest of his tale unfolds like a cautionary dream about artistic compromise. He lived in a house of 38 rooms, scattered across 36 worlds, each room opening through Farcaster portals to different vistas, glaciers on one world, oceans on another, mountain peaks on a third. He joined the Caribou Herd, that collection of wealthy artists and addicts who wandered between worlds in an endless party. But his muse fled him, you see. The true poetry dried up as he was forced to write sequel after sequel to his one success, each book more formulaic than the last, until he was nothing but a hack grinding out garbage for the masses. The poet who had once touched the divine through suffering had become a literary prostitute, selling his talent by the word. As Martin concludes this portion of his tale aboard the barge, the other pilgrims sit in contemplative silence, perhaps seeing in his story a mirror of their own compromises, their own falls from grace. The night deepens around them as they drift onwards through the darkness, drawn inexorably toward their appointment with the Shrike. And so, dear listener, Martin Silness continues his tale as the barge drifts ever onwards through the Hyperion night. His story takes a darker turn now, moving from commercial compromise to something far more sinister. When we left him, Martin had become the most successful hack writer in the web, churning out sequel after sequel to his bastardized Dying Earth series. But imagine, if you will, the moment when an artist finally says, enough. After sending his publisher a single-sentence manuscript declaring the series dead, Martin makes his escape to the distant world of Asquith to join the artistic colony of Sad King Billy. Now, Sad King Billy, what a character to picture in your mind's eye. Think of a man who appears to have melted like a candle left too near a flame. His long hair runs in limp streams to his shoulders, his face cascades in wrinkles and folds, and his entire being suggests either buffoon or victim. Yet behind those basset hound eyes burns one of the keenest minds dedicated to art and literature since the true Renaissance. His clothing exists in permanent chaos, a velvet cape perpetually torn and gathering crumbs, mismatched sleeve ruffles, jam stains everywhere. The man stutters terribly, yet his passion for poetry runs deeper than oceans. When Martin arrives at this tumble-down kingdom of 2,000 square miles, King Billy greets him with understanding. The monarch has read both Martin's commercial success and his true masterwork, the Cantos. He recognizes the tragedy of an artist whose greatest work has been ignored while his worst has made him wealthy. And so Martin settles into the west wing of the palace, attempting once more to find his muse. But the muse remains stubbornly absent. For 9 long years, Martin's poetry stays technically perfect but spiritually dead. In desperation, he transforms himself through biosculpture into a satyr, complete with goat legs, hooves, and other modifications. He becomes a creature of pure decadence, a walking embodiment of debauchery that would make ancient Greek gods blush. The transformation works too well. Martin becomes legendary for his sexual appetites and drinking contests. But still, the true poetry won't come. Then, on the very night Martin has chosen to end his life, everything changes. The colony begins experiencing disappearances. At first, they assume people have simply wandered off, but then the bodies start appearing, or rather, parts of bodies. The sculptor Pete Garcia is found distributed across 3 locations. A beautiful young woman named Sisypris, one of Martin's former lovers, is discovered as just a head, placed carefully in the centre of a plaza like some ghastly offering. The killer reveals itself gradually. Through a hidden recording device, they witness the Shrike in action, that nightmare fusion of chrome and bone, 3 meters tall, with a skull surrounded by thorns, eyes like burning rubies, and fingers that are more like steel scalpels. This is the creature from Hyperion legend, the Lord of Pain, the Angel of Final Atonement. Martin knows immediately what has happened. He has summoned the Shrike through his poetry. By beginning to write his epic poem about this creature, he has somehow called it into being. It's a paradox worthy of contemplation in these quiet hours. The Shrike exists because of the poem, but the poem cannot exist without the Shrike as muse. As murders continue, the colony evacuates. 6,000 souls flee back to the web, but Martin stays behind with a handful of others in the increasingly empty city. The white towers begin to crumble. Desert sands creep through the abandoned plazas. Vines strangle the beautiful glass galleries. For 12 years, Martin continues writing his Hyperion Cantos, sustained by the proximity of his terrible muse. The climax comes when King Billy returns, finding Martin alone in the ruins. The king has discovered the connection between the murders and Martin's writing. Each death corresponds to a burst of creative output. Billy decides to end the madness by burning the manuscript, all 1,000 pages of it. In the courtyard of the ruined palace, under a sky bright with meteor showers, Billy begins feeding pages to the flames. Martin, partially paralyzed by a neural stunner, can only watch in horror as his life's work burns. Then the Shrike appears, lifting King Billy high, impaling him on thorns that emerge from his chest like bloody butterflies pinned to a board. In that terrible moment, with his patron and friend dying in agony, Martin makes the only choice he can. He douses both Billy and the Shrike with kerosene and sets them ablaze. The scream that follows echoes through eternity. Whether from man, monster, or both, we'll never know. And so the Shrike vanishes, taking Martin's muse with it, leaving him unable to finish his great work. And so we drift now, like the wind wagon itself crossing that endless sea of grass, toward the scholar's tale. Sol Weintraub, that gentle academic with his precious burden, finally begins to share his story with the other pilgrims as the massive wooden vessel creaks and groans through the darkness. Picture, if you will, the warm interior of that captain's cabin, lanterns swaying gently with the ship's movement, casting dancing shadows across the makeshift table of stacked trunks. The pilgrims have settled in for the night, and Sol adjusts his glasses, cradles his infant daughter Rachel, and begins to speak in that careful, precise voice of his. He takes us back to a simpler time, to Barnard's world, where he and his wife Siri had built a life of quiet contentment. Imagine the flat, endless fields of that agricultural world, stretching to every horizon, broken only by the neat geometry of Crawford, their small university town. The streets there were wide and peaceful, overarched with ancient elms and oaks that had been brought from old Earth itself centuries before. White houses sat far back on perfectly manicured lawns, and at the heart of it all stood Knightenhelser College, with its red brick buildings and white pillars surrounding the oval common. Sol had been teaching there for 10 years when Rachel was born. You can almost smell the chalk dust and old wood of Plasher Hall, feel the deeply worn grooves in the steps carved by 20 generations of students. From his third-floor office he could look out through bare winter branches at the common below, finding peace in the unchanging rhythms of academic life. Siri, his wife, had been a music critic, a woman whose warmth and energy made up for what she herself thought she lacked in conventional beauty. She'd studied on other worlds, but always felt homesick for those endless Barnard sunsets, where the red star would hang on the horizon for hours like a great tethered balloon while the sky slowly congealed into evening. When Rachel finally arrived after 5 years of hoping, she transformed their orderly academic existence into something richer, more chaotic, more complete. Picture those first months, the gentle exhaustion, the midnight feedings, those moments when Sol and Siri would stand together in the nursery doorway, watching their miracle of a baby sleeping with her little bottom in the air, face burrowed into the crib bumper. Rachel grew into one of those rare children who managed to be genuinely delightful without becoming precious. By 5, she showed all the signs of true giftedness: structured curiosity, deep empathy, and a fierce sense of fairness that would have her emptying the family pantry to feed migrant workers or climbing the tallest elm in Crawford on a dare. As Saul tells his story, you can sense the warmth in his voice when he describes Rachel's academic achievements, her choice to follow archaeology, her decision to stay at Knightenhelser when universities across the web courted her. She was drawn to the mysteries of the past, always had been since those afternoons as a toddler, digging under the front porch, rushing in with every plastic plate and tarnished coin she'd found, demanding to know who had left it there. Then came her expedition to Hyperion. Sol's voice grows quieter here, more careful. Rachel was part of a team studying those mysterious time tombs, working with the renowned Dr. Melio Arendes. For months she and Melio would descend into the Sphinx at midnight, sitting in its basement under countless tons of stone, monitoring cosmic ray detectors, listening through earphones to the ping of particles born in dying stars far away. One night, with only 3 weeks left in her year of research, Rachel went alone to the Sphinx. The anti-entropic fields, those strange time tides that made the tombs so dangerous, were supposed to be at their lowest ebb. But something went terribly, inexplicably wrong. Sol's voice falters slightly as he describes what happened next. The instruments went wild, showing impossible readings, chambers appearing where none had existed, corridors twisting back on themselves like Mobius strips. Then the lights failed, all of them, impossibly, even the ones that needed no power. In that absolute darkness, something found Rachel. When her team discovered her hours later, she was unconscious, and she would remain that way for 17 weeks. Sol and Sarai's agony during those months of waiting, while their daughter travelled through space in a medical ship, stretched like an eternity. But the real horror came after Rachel awakened. The anti-entropic field had changed her in a way that defied all medical understanding. She was aging backward, not just physically, though that was happening too, but mentally. Each time she slept, she would forget the previous day and everything since the accident. She would wake up thinking she was one day younger, one day further back in her own past. The doctors called it Merlin's sickness, and they had no cure, no treatment, no real understanding of how it worked. Rachel tried to continue her life, returning to university, staying with Melio, but imagine waking each morning to a world that has jumped forward in time, to a lover who claims to know you but whom you've never seen before, to parents who look inexplicably older. Sol describes, in that measured way of his, how Rachel finally came home, how they tried to help her maintain some normalcy, creating orientation videos she would watch each morning to explain what had happened to her. The heartbreak of her 22nd birthday party, when old friends came to celebrate, but to Rachel they were strangers aged beyond recognition, people claiming to know her, with children of their own, talking of things she couldn't remember. And through it all, Saul had begun having dreams, dark visions where a voice commanded him to take Rachel to Hyperion, to offer her as a sacrifice at the time tombs. Each time he refused, angry and defiant, but the dreams persisted, growing more urgent. As Saul concludes this first part of his tale, the Windwagon continues its journey across the Sea of Grass. The pilgrims sit in contemplative silence, the only sounds the creak of wood, the whisper of wind through rigging, and somewhere below, the steady rumble of the great wheel carrying them inexorably toward the mountains, toward the time tombs, toward whatever destiny awaits them in that strange and terrible place. The night deepens around them, and you can almost feel the gentle sway of the vessel, the warmth of the lantern light, the weight of Saul's sorrow as he holds his infant daughter, who was once 26, who grows younger with each passing day, who will continue to fade until... But that part of the story must wait. For now, there is only the darkness, the gentle motion of the ship, and the soft breathing of a baby who dreams, perhaps, of times she'll never remember, or times she's already forgotten. And so we return to Sol's tale, drifting deeper into the heartbreaking chronicle of a father, watching time steal his daughter away, day by precious day. As the Windwagon continues its steady journey across the Sea of Grass, You can almost feel the gentle sway of the vessel, the creak of ancient wood, and the weight of Sol's memories settling around us like a soft, heavy blanket. In the months following the accident on Hyperion, Sol became rather like a detective, searching through every scrap of information about the time tombs and the mysterious Shrike. Picture him in his study, surrounded by towers of books and data tablets, the warm lamplight casting shadows across his furrowed brow as he searched for answers that seemed to slip away like morning mist. He visited the Shrike churches scattered throughout the web, those strange temples with their twisted architecture and blood-red ceremonies, but found their doctrines as unhelpful as smoke, all mysticism and prophecy, with no practical wisdom to offer a desperate father. Meanwhile, Melio Arendez, that dedicated archaeologist who loved Rachel, launched another expedition to Hyperion, hoping to understand the time-tide phenomenon that had cursed her. But it would take 3 long years just to reach that distant world, and Sol knew in his heart that Rachel couldn't wait that long. The universe seemed to move at its own glacial pace while his daughter slipped away, moment by moment. The medical specialists came in endless processions, like pilgrims to a shrine, each one confident they understood Rachel's condition until they actually examined her. Sol's frustration would boil over sometimes, particularly with the pompous ones who spoke in riddles about reversed entropy and time equations. They could describe what was happening to Rachel in mathematical terms, but none could explain why, and certainly none could stop it. On Rachel's 21st birthday, though she believed herself to be approaching her 21st for the first time, she came to Sol late one night, unable to sleep. They sat together in the quiet kitchen, sharing whiskey and laughter, telling old jokes until tears streamed down their faces. But then the mood shifted, as it always did, and Rachel confessed that despite reading all the information she'd left for herself, despite seeing the evidence of her condition, she couldn't truly believe it. The Rachel who had lived those lost years, who had fallen in love with someone named Melio, who had travelled to Hyperion, that was someone else entirely, a stranger whose pain she shouldn't have to bear. Sol made a promise that night, holding his daughter as she wept. They would stop telling her each morning about her condition, let her wake to each day fresh, without the burden of knowing what she'd lost. The years continued their cruel reversal. By the time Rachel was 16 again, or rather believed herself to be 16 for the first time, Sol and Siri had undergone Paulson treatments to appear younger, trying desperately to match the image their daughter expected of her parents. You can imagine them studying old photographs, carefully choosing clothes from decades past, all to spare their child one more confusion in her increasingly bewildering world. But privacy was becoming impossible. The media discovered their story, and soon their quiet life in Crawford was shattered by the constant presence of reporters and gawkers. The Morning Sol found 7-year-old Rachel surrounded by aggressive journalists, their camera implants gleaming like predatory eyes. He knew their peaceful existence had ended. They fled to Hebron, that desert world where privacy was valued above all else. Picture their new home in the village of Dan, adobe walls that glowed pink in the evening light, curved archways instead of sharp corners, and beyond the orange groves an endless expanse of golden desert that seemed to swallow troubles whole. The kibbutz community wrapped around them like a protective embrace, giving Rachel playmates who greeted her anew each day without question, allowing Sol to find unexpected peace in physical labour among the orchards. But even in this sanctuary the nights were difficult. Sol would find Siri watching over their sleeping daughter, tears silent on her cheeks, and increasingly, Sol found himself engaged in fierce debates with something, God perhaps, though Sol had never believed in a personal deity who concerned himself with individual human struggles. These weren't prayers but arguments, demanding to know how any ethical system could flow from a command to sacrifice one's child. Then came the revelation that shattered their fragile equilibrium. Siri had been having the same dreams as Sol, dark visions of a place with red lights above, a voice commanding them to take Rachel to Hyperion. For over a year she'd been planning, believing they should offer themselves as a sacrifice instead of their daughter. Sol retreated to the mountains for 3 days, wrestling with this terrible knowledge beneath the burning desert sun. But the answer that came was worse than the question. The universe had already accepted the sacrifice of parents throughout history. Something else was required. They decided Siri should visit home just for a week to see her sister and breathe familiar air. It would be good for her, Sol reasoned, a brief respite from their crushing vigil. The morning after Siri left, 4-year-old Rachel discovered the old photographs and recordings hidden in a closet. The child's confusion at seeing an older version of herself, hearing a confident woman's voice claiming to be Rachel, tore at Sol's heart. Then came the call. You can feel the cold settling in Sol's stomach as a stranger's hologram materialized in their living room that Sabbath evening. There had been an accident, an impossible collision between 2 EMVs, one carrying Siri and her sister Lethe to the opera, the other stolen by reckless teenagers. In the space of a heartbeat, Sol's world contracted to just himself and a daughter who would wake tomorrow, having forgotten her mother had ever left. The funeral on Barnard's world was besieged by media, but afterward, Sol and Rachel returned to their desert sanctuary. Each morning he sat by her bedside, ready with gentle lies when she asked for her mother. Each morning the pain was fresh for her, and therefore fresh for him. As Rachel approached her 3rd birthday, growing younger and smaller with each passing day, Sol began petitioning the Church of the Shrike for permission to join their pilgrimage to the Time Tombs. It was a desperate measure, but desperation was all he had left. The evening of Rachel's 3rd birthday, after reading her favourite fairy tale about Sleeping Beauty twice, she called out her nightly farewell that had become their ritual across the years. "Later, alligator," she whispered. And Sol, standing in the doorway of her room, watching his daughter settle into sleep, whispered back into the darkness, "Wild crocodile." The section ends here, with Sol standing in that doorway, carrying the weight of impossible choices, while somewhere in the distance Hyperion waits with its mysterious tombs and its promise of either salvation or damnation. The windwagon continues on through the night, and you can almost hear Sol's voice growing quieter as this portion of his tale draws to its close, leaving us suspended in that terrible moment between hope and despair. And now we come to the most heartbreaking portion of Sol's tale, where time's cruel reversal transforms from tragedy to something almost unbearable to witness. Picture, if you will, the gentle scholar watching his daughter fade, not into old age, but into infancy, each day stealing away another piece of the woman she had been. The physical changes came gradually at first, then with devastating swiftness. Rachel's adult teeth had long since fallen away, replaced by baby teeth that themselves began to recede. Her beautiful hair, which had always been her pride, grew thin and wispy, like that of a newborn. The face Sol had known for decades softened and rounded with baby fat, obscuring those familiar features he'd loved. When the day came that she could no longer walk, when her legs simply couldn't support her anymore, Sol placed her gently in the crib they'd prepared and retreated to his study. There, alone in the darkness, he allowed himself the release of drink and tears. But it was the loss of language that wounded him most deeply. Each word that slipped away was like watching a bridge burn between them, connection by connection. He remembered teaching her the old farewell ritual. "See you later, alligator," watching her giggle and respond with, "In a while, crocodile." By morning, even this simple exchange had vanished from her memory, lost in time's relentless current. Sol carried Rachel everywhere now, cradled against his chest as he traversed the web, desperately seeking help. To the grand halls of the Senate he went, to research institutes with their gleaming laboratories, to the mysterious temples of the Shrike Church. The weight of her small body against him, barely 25 pounds now, was both burden and comfort. Sometimes, feeling the warmth of her cheek against his, breathing in that sweet infant scent, he could almost forget the cosmic injustice of it all. Almost. His nights were filled with fierce, silent arguments with a god he claimed not to believe in, demanding answers for this suffering, this reversal of nature itself. And sometimes, in the desert silence of their Hebron home, he thought he heard responses, not in words but in understanding that transcended language. When Rachel spoke her last word, Mama, at just 5 months old, something fundamental shifted in Sol's world. Her universe had contracted to its most basic elements: warmth, food, sleep, and the presence of this bearded man who held her with such infinite tenderness. Then came the dream that changed everything. Aboard the warship Intrepid, as they hurtled through space toward Hyperion, Sol found himself in a vast structure with columns like ancient trees, bathed in crimson light. The voice that echoed through that immense space commanded him to sacrifice his daughter. But Sol, gentle Sol who had spent his life in scholarly contemplation, roared back his defiance. There would be no more sacrifices, he declared to the darkness. The time of obedience was past, and Rachel, infant Rachel who could no longer speak, somehow communicated her agreement, her consciousness touching his in that strange dream space between the stars. As dawn broke over the vast sea of grass, painting the world in shades of gold beneath gathering storm clouds, our weary pilgrims found themselves facing a rather disturbing mystery. The Consul had spent the night without sleep, watching from the highest deck of the windwagon as the sun blessed the world with a brief, brilliant benediction before disappearing behind the ceiling of clouds. The morning air carried a chill from the distant Bridle Range mountains, and as Braun Lamia and Martin Silenus joined him with their morning coffee, there was an unspoken tension among them all. It was Father Hoyt who made the terrible discovery. Simply passing by Hetmastein's cabin on his way to the upper deck, he noticed the door slightly ajar. What he glimpsed inside sent a single sharp cry echoing through the morning air. Blood. So much blood. The Templar's cabin, otherwise neat as a pin with his belongings precisely arranged, was painted with great swaths of crimson across the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. Yet of Hetmastein himself there was no sign. The pilgrims gathered in that terrible room, each processing the horror in their own way. Braun Lamia, ever the detective, stepped forward to examine the scene with professional detachment. She confirmed what they all feared. It was indeed blood, though whose blood remained a mystery. The porthole was still latched from the inside, the bed unslept in, the Templar's robes folded neatly over a chair as if he'd simply stepped out for a moment. They searched the windwagon from stem to stern, working in pairs for safety. Colonel Kassad distributed weapons, small neural stunners to those who had none, while Lamia carried an ancient pistol that seemed almost quaint in comparison. The search revealed nothing. No hidden passages, no secret compartments where their missing companion might be concealed. Even Kassad's heat and motion sensors detected nothing larger than a mouse aboard the vessel. Among Mastein's belongings they discovered his travel trunk filled with seedlings, 100 offspring of the eternal tree, as was the Templar custom. But it was the metal box at the bottom of his luggage that drew their attention. A Mobius cube, Kassad identified it. A containment field that could hold almost anything, even a nuclear explosion if properly timed. The Consul believed he knew what lay within, an Urgi, one of those mysterious energy creatures that Templars used aboard their great tree ships. Perhaps Mastein had thought it would protect him when he faced the Shrike. If so, it had failed him utterly. As the windwagon continued its journey toward the mountains through increasingly violent weather, the pilgrims huddled below deck, contemplating this new horror. In Mastein's pocket, they'd found a slip of paper with the number 5. He would have told his tale next. Now that story would never be heard. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke as they approached Pilgrim's Rest, that desolate collection of burned hovels that marked the beginning of their mountain crossing. The tramway station loomed before them through sheets of icy rain, and relief washed over them when Kassad spotted one of the cable cars still intact at the platform. Their journey could continue, though the cars weren't moving as they should be, suggesting the system had been abandoned. Wrapped in heavy coats against the bitter cold, Kassad in his military thermoflage, Lamia in her long trench coat, Silenus buried in colour-shifting furs, they transferred their belongings to the ancient tramcar. The vehicle was stark and utilitarian. Metal benches in the main compartment, rough bunks in the rear, windows rising from waist to ceiling that would offer spectacular views once they rose above the storm. It was Kassad who got the machinery working, though not without drama. After setting the mechanisms in motion from the operator's cabin high above, he had to make a desperate sprint and leap to catch the already moving car. For one heart-stopping moment, it seemed he would fall to the rocks below, but with impossible grace and speed, he caught the edge and pulled himself aboard. As they rose into the clouds, leaving the windwagon dark and lifeless below them, the car's heating slowly came to life, and with it, a sense of fragile normalcy returned. They prepared a simple meal from their supplies, and Martin Silenus opened bottles of wine he'd thoughtfully brought along. As they climbed higher, they suddenly broke through the cloud ceiling into a world transformed. The setting sun painted the peaks around them in shades of gold and crimson, while below stretched an endless sea of clouds. It was then, in that moment of ethereal beauty suspended between earth and sky, that Braun Lamia began her tale. She was a private investigator from Lucis, she explained, working from a shabby office in the industrial district where rain perpetually drizzled through rusted girders. Her story began when a beautiful young man walked through her door, someone whose very presence seemed to radiate an unusual quality, a mixture of strength and sensitivity that immediately captured her attention. This client, who called himself Johnny, presented her with an extraordinary case. He claimed to be a cybrid, a physical body controlled by an artificial intelligence residing somewhere in the vast data sphere of the technocore. Even more remarkably, he insisted he had been murdered. Not just his physical form, but the AI consciousness itself had been attacked with something called an AIDS-2 virus, a weapon that turned an AI's own defenses against itself. The attack had cost him 5 days of memory, and he desperately needed to know what had happened during that lost time. Johnny's true nature was even more fascinating. His AI persona had been built upon a retrieval of an ancient Earth poet named John Keats, who had lived and died centuries before the Hegira. Through careful reconstruction from writings, letters, and poetry, the Technocore had rebuilt a personality that served as the template for this AI consciousness. Johnny spent his days in a library on Renaissance Vector, searching for fragments of an unfinished poem called Hyperion, a work Keats had never completed. As Lamia investigated, following Johnny through the Farcaster web, tracking his credit wake, interviewing witnesses, she uncovered disturbing patterns. Cybrids throughout the web were disappearing, being recalled by the Technocore for unknown reasons. The murder had taken place on Madia, a desolate mining world where someone had lured Johnny to that barren plateau of grey stone and sulphurous air. The case grew more complex with each revelation. Johnny lived alone in a modest apartment, maintained a routine of library research and quiet dinners, yet someone had marked him for death, or at least for the traumatic disconnection that served as death for an AI. The implications were staggering. Someone had deliberately attacked not just the cybrid body, but the artificial consciousness itself, using a weapon specifically designed to destroy AI entities. As the tramcar continued its long journey through the night, rising and falling with the mountain peaks, Braun Lamia continued unravelling her tale for her fellow pilgrims. Outside the windows, snow began to fall, and lightning illuminated the towering peaks around them. Her investigation would take her deep into the mysteries of the Technocore, the world of cybrids and artificial intelligences, and ultimately to truths about the nature of consciousness itself. The other pilgrims listened intently as the car swayed gently on its cables, carrying them ever closer to their destination, to the time tombs where each would face their fate. But for now, suspended between heaven and earth in their metal cocoon, they had only Lamia's voice and her story of a beautiful cybrid named Johnny who had died and lived to tell about it. And so, dear listener, we return to Braun Lamia's extraordinary tale, drifting deeper into the mysteries that surround her cybrid client, Johnny. As the tramcar continues its gentle journey through the mountain passes, swaying on its cables like a cradle suspended between earth and sky, she tells her fellow pilgrims of the investigation that would lead her into realms far stranger than any detective could imagine. Picture, if you will, a dimly lit bar on Renaissance Vector, one of those establishments where the afternoon light filters through grimy windows, casting long shadows across worn tables. Here, Braun had traced Johnny's movements, following the faint trail of his credit wake to this rather unremarkable place. An old man sits nursing his whiskey, his weathered face telling its own story of countless afternoons spent in exactly this spot. When Braun shows him Johnny's photograph, something flickers in those rheumy eyes. Recognition, perhaps mixed with the calculating look of someone who sees an opportunity. The old man's memory, loosened by the promise of payment and perhaps by the whiskey warming his bones, recalls a peculiar meeting. Johnny had been there, yes, but not alone. There had been a Templar. Imagine the incongruity of it. One of those tree-worshipping monks in their brown robes, sitting in this shabby bar. And another man, shorter, stronger, with a queue, that distinctive ponytail that marks certain colonists. They had talked quietly, intensely, with Johnny seeming surprised by something the Templar said. As Braun pieces together this puzzle, she feels the weight of unseen forces moving around her client. The three men had left separately, first the Templar vanishing like morning mist, then Johnny departing with the man with the queue. It's this second figure who troubles her most, this mysterious companion who seems to shadow Johnny's movements. The next morning brings a careful dance of surveillance. Johnny travels his usual route to the library, but this time with deliberate detours through multiple worlds. And there, following like a faithful shadow, is Q, for that's how Braun thinks of him now. Through the Old Settlers Museum, across Nordholm, and finally to God's Grove, that sacred Templar world where the great world trees grow taller than mountains. On God's Grove, beneath those impossibly vast branches that stretch like highways in the sky, Braun confronts Q directly. There's something almost dreamlike about their chase through the various worlds of the Templar excursion, from the tropical beauty of Fuji with its carefully tended gardens, through the violet waves of Mare Infinitus, where wooden walkways curve above coral reefs, to the frozen wastes of Sol Draconi Septum, where the wind howls like a living thing. In that terrible cold where the containment field keeps the blizzard at bay, they struggle. Q has an energy pistol, its bolts searing the frozen air, while Braun battles through snowdrifts that threaten to swallow her whole. The cold burns her lungs, turns her fingers to wood, but she presses on with that determined strength that seems to define her. Then to Maui Covenant, where the warm air feels like a blessing after the Arctic wastes. Here, on a motile isle that drifts across endless blue seas, its great tree sails catching the wind, they fight hand to hand on the sandy shore. The struggle is brutal, primal, two strong bodies testing their limits against each other. And then, just when Braun has Q subdued, something terrible happens. Blue fire erupts from within him, not natural flame, but something electric, consuming. Q burns from the inside out, his body destroying itself in a horrific display that leaves only charred remains on the beautiful beach. It's the death of a cybrid, Braun realizes, a self-destruct mechanism built into these artificial bodies. Which means Q wasn't human at all, but another AI construct, watching Johnny for reasons still unknown. Escaping on an ancient hawking mat, one of those flying carpets from Maui Covenant's romantic past, Braun finds herself drifting over endless ocean, the mat's flight threads carrying her slowly through the warm air. Below, the sea stretches to every horizon, broken only by the occasional shadow of clouds painting patterns on the waves. Johnny's voice guides her to safety through her comlog, leading her to a hidden submarine base where a military farcaster waits. And then, stepping through that portal, she emerges into a place that shouldn't exist. A perfect recreation of old Earth's Rome, complete with the Colosseum standing ancient and proud against a pale blue sky. This is the Technocore's secret, Johnny reveals as they walk the cobblestone streets in the gathering dusk. Not just Rome, but all of old Earth, recreated in impossible detail somewhere in the Hercules cluster, millions of light years from human space. Every continent, every city, existing in different time periods depending on what the mysterious AI projects require. In a small apartment near the Spanish Steps, as pigeons wheel against the evening sky, and the fountain in the piazza below makes its eternal music, Johnny tells Braun about the Keats project, how the Techno-Core had attempted to resurrect the consciousness of the poet John Keats, dead these many centuries. How he had awakened in the very room where the original Keats died, tended by cybrid recreations of the friends who had nursed the dying poet. The cruelty of it touches something deep. Imagine awakening with memories of being someone else, of dying of consumption at 26, of being too poor to marry the woman you loved. Johnny speaks of the Techno-Core's ultimate intelligence project, their 700-year quest to create God through computational means. Perhaps these resurrection experiments, these elaborate recreations, are all part of that incomprehensible goal. That night, in the soft candlelight of that impossible apartment in that impossible Rome, Braun and Johnny become lovers. There's something achingly human about their connection, despite Johnny's artificial nature, the warmth of skin against skin, the gentle touches, the protective curve of his hand on her hip as they drift toward sleep. But morning brings violence. Men burst through their door, professional fighters working with practiced efficiency. The fight is vicious, desperate, with Braun battling naked against clothed opponents. One attacker goes through the window, another's skull is crushed beneath the heavy bed she lifts in desperation. When the violence ends, blood stains the floor and questions hang heavy in the air. These attackers work for the Shrike temple on Lucis, one gasps through punctured lungs. They wanted Johnny brought to them, though they would have killed Braun if necessary. Following the trail in their vehicle, our detective and her cybrid lover find themselves in the vast, shadowy interior of the Shrike temple itself. The bishop, massive in his red robes, reveals a shocking truth. Johnny had volunteered for the Shrike pilgrimage just days ago, during the time lost to his memory. The recording proves it, though neither Johnny nor Braun can understand why. The Sequoia Sempervirens, a Templar tree ship, will carry pilgrims to Hyperion in just 9 days. The Church of the Final Atonement believes this may be the last pilgrimage before their prophesied apocalypse. And so, as Braun concludes this portion of her tale to her fellow travellers, the mystery deepens rather than resolves. Who tried to murder Johnny's AI consciousness? Why did he volunteer for the pilgrimage during his lost days? What is the true purpose of the Techno-Core's resurrection of old Earth? The questions spiral like smoke in the evening air, each answer revealing new puzzles, each revelation casting longer shadows. The truth seems to wait on Hyperion itself, where the time tombs are opening and the Shrike walks free. And so we return to Braun Lamia's tale, as she reveals the deeper mysteries of Johnny's nature and the terrible price they both would pay for understanding. The night air around the pilgrims grows colder as her story continues, the stars above them distant witnesses to revelations that would shake the very foundations of their reality. In that quiet apartment where Braun and Johnny had taken refuge, he began to explain what made him different from other cybrids. You see, there was a way, a desperate, irreversible way, for an artificial intelligence to become truly human. It had been done only once before, with a reconstruction of an ancient poet named Ezra Pound, though that attempt had ended in madness. Johnny spoke of this possibility with a mixture of hope and fear, his voice growing softer as he described how an AI could invest its entire consciousness into the organic brain of its cybrid body. The transformation would be devastating, he explained. Less than 1% of 1% of an AI's vast consciousness could survive such a transition. The resulting being would be neither the original AI nor a proper cybrid, but something else entirely, perhaps human, perhaps touched with what Johnny called a divine madness. As he stood by the window, gazing out at the industrial landscape beyond, Johnny recited poetry from memory, verses about dreams and paradise that seemed to flow from some deep well within him. In that moment, Braun understood. He had already made his decision. He would become human, truly human, and journey to Hyperion. Their meeting with Minor Gladstone took place in the most secure of settings. Picture, if you will, the CEO of all human space leading Braun through a Farcaster portal to a world of endless golden grass, where no electronic surveillance could reach them. There, beneath a pale yellow sky streaked with copper clouds, Gladstone revealed truths that the Hegemony had kept hidden for generations. The Techno-Core had indeed rebuilt old Earth in secret, somewhere in the vastness of space. More disturbing still, The time tombs on Hyperion were moving backward through time, carrying something from the far future into their present. Gladstone spoke of coming war, of the ousters approaching Hyperion, of forces being set in motion that could not be stopped. The grass around them rippled like waves in an ocean of gold as she explained how the tombs represented an anomaly that even the core's vast predictive powers couldn't penetrate. When Braun told her of Johnny's plans, the older woman's face hardened like stone. There would be no pilgrimage ships allowed to leave, she declared. The coming war would see to that. But Johnny would not be deterred. In the dim light of BB Serbringer's cluttered apartment, surrounded by the gentle hum of countless machines, they prepared for the most dangerous infiltration ever attempted. BB, with his cyberpunk expertise and reckless courage, would help Johnny transfer his consciousness while simultaneously breaking into the Technocore's most guarded secrets. The datum plane assault was like diving into a hurricane of pure information where security programs prowled like predators and the very architecture of cyberspace could kill. When Johnny died, for that's what the transformation required, a kind of death, the explosion in datum plane was catastrophic. Through the chaos and the searching claws of defensive programs, BB managed to retrieve the data they sought. But the cost, oh, the terrible cost. BB's brilliant mind was destroyed by the core's defenses, his skull split open by the backlash of lethal programs. Johnny survived the transformation, emerging as something new, carrying within him both the memories of John Keats and the stolen knowledge of the core's deepest secrets. In the depths of Dreggs' hive, that lawless undercity where outcasts made their homes, Johnny revealed what BB had discovered. The Technocore was divided into 3 factions, each with its own vision for humanity's future. The stables sought continued symbiosis, the volatiles demanded immediate human extinction, and the ultimates cared only for their project to create an ultimate intelligence, essentially, to build God through pure computation. The opening of the time tombs would bring war, that much was certain, but whether the Shrike that emerged would be humanity's destroyer or its unlikely salvation remained unknowable. Their escape through the concourse mall became a symphony of violence and desperation. Armed and armoured like ancient warriors, Johnny and Braun fought through waves of attackers while civilians fled in terror. The air filled with the whine of weapons fire, the crash of shattering glass, the thunder of explosions. Johnny fell, wounded mortally, his body broken and burning. Yet Braun carried him up those temple stairs, each step an eternity of effort, until they reached the sanctuary of the Shrike Church. There, in the cool darkness of the temple floor, Johnny died for the second and final time. But in his last moment, his hand found the neural shunt he'd had implanted in Braun's skull, and everything he was, every memory, every thought, every quantum of his being, flowed into the Shrun loop buried in her brain. She carried him still, not just his child growing within her, but his very essence, waiting for whatever destiny awaited them in the shadow of the Shrike. The pilgrims sat in contemplative silence as Braun's tale concluded, the tramcar continuing its steady journey between ice and stars. As the evening shadows lengthen across the ancient stones of Cronus Keep, we find our 6 remaining pilgrims entering a place of profound darkness and memory. Picture, if you will, this massive fortress carved from the very bones of the mountain itself, 300 rooms of sweating stone, corridors that wind through darkness like the passages of a troubled dream, and everywhere, absolutely everywhere, the lingering presence of violence that has recently visited these halls. The keep rises from the easternmost edge of the bridle range like something from a gothic nightmare. Gargoyles peer down from every conceivable angle, their stone eyes following anyone who dares to walk beneath them. Stained glass windows, some 100 meters tall, catch the dying light and throw it across floors stained with something far darker than time. The Shrike Church had occupied this place for 2 centuries, and their departure, or rather their violent removal, has left behind a cathedral of carnage. Martin Silenus, ever the sardonic poet, breaks the heavy silence with his characteristic dark humour as they explore the blood-spattered dining hall, where meals sit rotting on tables, and the walls bear witness to unspeakable violence. The sound of flies creates a constant, unsettling drone that seems to emphasize the wrongness of this place. Father Hoyt, despite everything he's witnessed, finds himself awed by the sheer scale of the architecture, comparing it to the great cathedrals of his faith. From the balconies of the keep, they can glimpse the abandoned city of poets in the distance, those white structures gleaming like broken teeth in the sand, haunted now by memories and perhaps by more tangible ghosts. The time tombs themselves remain hidden beyond the next rise of hills, waiting with their mysterious patience. Colonel Cassard, ever the soldier, takes charge of their safety, finding defensible rooms high in the keep where they can spend what might be their last night together. These chambers, mercifully, are free from the signs of slaughter that mark so much of the fortress. As they settle in for their evening meal, the last of their provisions, some wine from Selinus's dwindling supply, and a touching gesture from Sol Weintraub, a stale cake meant to celebrate their final evening as a complete group. And then, as darkness truly falls, the sky above them erupts into a terrible beauty. The war has begun in earnest. Imagine, if you will, the velvet darkness suddenly torn apart by fusion explosions that bloom like deadly flowers across the heavens. Plasma bursts in blue and yellow, and the most brilliant red curl inward upon themselves. Defensive singularities twist the very fabric of space, creating aurora displays that would be breathtaking if they weren't so terrifying. The Ouster invasion fleet has engaged the Hegemony forces, and our pilgrims watch from their stone balcony as humanity tears itself apart in the stars above. Through his military field glasses, Cassard confirms what they're witnessing: a massive space battle at least 3 astronomical units away, the Ousters testing the defences before the real assault begins. And there, moving across the darkened moors toward the time tombs, they spot a solitary figure in Templar robes. Could it be Het Mastine, somehow arrived before them? The mystery deepens, but there's no way to know for certain. It's in this moment of cosmic violence and uncertainty that the Consul finally agrees to tell his tale. He produces an ancient device, a comlog from the time of the Hegira itself, and begins to play a recording made 50 years ago. The voice that emerges is young, filled with a pain that time hasn't dulled, and behind it we can hear the eternal sounds of wind through grass and waves upon a shore. The story that unfolds takes us back to the Consul's grandfather, Merrin Aspic, and a forbidden love that would span decades and shape the destiny of an entire world. Young Merrin was a shipman, one of those near-immortal beings who crew the great spin ships, aging mere months while planets age years. On a forbidden journey away from his designated recreation island, riding an illegal hawking mat through the night sky with his friend Mike Osho, Merrin first glimpses the festival at First Sight Harbour. Picture this magical scene, the entire harbour ablaze with light, boats of every description bobbing in the warm waters, their masts hung with bells and lanterns. The returning motile isles sail past like living mountains, their tree sails billowing, while dolphins dance in the phosphorescent waters to the notes of Bach that echo across the waves. It's here, at this festival that celebrates the eternal dance between the sea and its islands, that young Merrin meets Siri. She appears first as a bird-bright figure in feathers and mask, but when she removes her disguise, her beauty burns brighter than any torch. Auburn hair catching the light, green eyes that seem to see through everything, and barely 16 years old to Merrin's 19. But time moves differently for shipmen, you see. While Merrin would age only months on his journeys between the stars, Siri would age years. Their love story unfolds across these terrible gaps of time. Each reunion, for that's what they called them, these moments when the ships returned, would find Siri older, changed, while Merrin remained essentially the same. We hear of their first night together on the hillside above the harbour, where a Thomas Hawk's cry interrupted their lovemaking, its wings painted silver by moonlight. We learn of their journey to the archipelago, where they lived for weeks in a tree house that swayed with the movement of the living island beneath them. And in one particularly beautiful memory, Siri takes Merrin to swim with the dolphins, using an old translation disc to speak with these inherited creatures from old Earth. Deep beneath the surface, holding onto the keel roots of the motile isle as it moves through the waters, they ask the dolphins what they miss most from their ancestral home. The answer comes back, strange and haunting. They miss the sharks, their ancient dance partners in the eternal ballet of predator and prey. The recording captures not just a love story, but the tragedy of two different kinds of time. Siri ages, has children, becomes a leader of her people, while Merrin remains frozen in youth, returning to find her changed each time. The story builds towards something darker. We sense it in the Consul's tension as he plays this recording, in the way his hands shake as he holds the ancient device. As the recording continues against the backdrop of space battles above, we understand that this is more than just a tale of star-crossed lovers. This is the story of how the Consul became who he is, why he carries such guilt, and perhaps why he activated the device that opened the time tombs prematurely. The night deepens around our pilgrims as they listen, each lost in their own thoughts about time and love and the prices we pay for both. Outside, the war continues its violent display, while inside, the past unfolds its secrets with the patient inevitability of tide returning to shore. And now, as the distant light of that terrible space battle continues to paint the walls of Cronus Keep in shades of crimson and gold, we return to the Consul's tale, a story within a story that takes us deeper into the tragedy that shaped not just one man, but the fate of entire worlds. The recording from that ancient comlog continues to play, and we find ourselves back on Maui Covenant with young Merrin Aspic and his friend Mike Osho. The festival night that had begun with such magic, those glowing lanterns bobbing on the warm waters, the returning isles like living mountains against the stars, now takes a darker turn. You see, in the crowded square near the harbour, where the celebration pulses with life and music, a confrontation begins to brew. A young colonist named Bertel, cousin to Siri herself, approaches Mike with all the fury of the separatist movement burning in his eyes. The separatists, you understand, are those who want nothing to do with the hegemony, who see these visitors from the stars as invaders rather than guests. And poor Mike, still dressed in his fool's costume with bells jingling at every movement, tries to deflect the tension with humour. But sometimes, my dear listeners, humour isn't enough. The confrontation escalates with that terrible momentum that violence often carries. Bertel demands satisfaction, throwing down a sword in challenge. Imagine, a sword in an age of space travel. Mike, with his construction laser in hand, tries to defend himself with the lowest possible setting, just enough to singe and warn. But in the chaos, in that horrible moment when Merrin tries to intervene, Bertel's blade finds its mark. And here, in this moment of senseless tragedy, Mike Osho dies. Not a temporary death that technology might reverse, but a true, final death. Brain death. His last words, delivered with that dark humour he carried to the end, about being cut down by a piece of cutlery from a one-penny opera. The crowd backs away as Merrin holds his dying friend, knowing that the ship above could save him if only they could reach it in time. But time, as always in this tale, is the enemy. What follows is vengeance, swift and terrible. Merrin takes up the laser, turns it to maximum, and we can only imagine the screams and scorched flesh that follow. When Siri arrives in her skimmer to pull him away from the madness, he is already lost to his grief and rage. The recording shifts then, jumping forward through time as these recordings do, showing us glimpses of what comes after. We see Siri at different ages, at 26, pregnant with Merrin's child, missing him across the 10 years that will pass for her while he ages only months. We see her as a 16-year-old, angry that he left without saying goodbye. And finally we hear her last message, "Adieu, Merrin, adieu." But the story doesn't end with that recording. The Consul pauses the ancient device and shares what comes next, how Merrin and Siri's love story spans decades of reunions, each one finding her older while he remains young. Picture them on the fishing boat Ginny Paul, weathering storms together, she at 70, Weathered and wise, he's still in his 20s. They speak of what will come when the Farcasters open, when millions will flood through to colonize their ocean world. And then, in one of those reunions, after Siri has grown old and Merrin remains forever young, she dies. But even in death, she leaves him one final gift, one final act of rebellion. Hidden in her tomb, which the Consul visits as an old man himself, is the hawking mat, that magical flying carpet from the night Mike died, along with weapons and the means to fight back. You see, Merrin doesn't simply grieve, he acts. In a moment of desperate courage, he destroys the Farcaster itself, just as it's being activated, creating a tiny nova in Maui Covenant's sky. The device meant to connect their world to the web becomes instead a collapsing singularity, buying his world perhaps a few more years of freedom. But here's where our story takes its most tragic turn, dear listeners. The Consul, our Consul sitting here in Kronos Keep, reveals himself to be the grandson of Siri and Merrin. He tells us how the Hegemony returned with force, how the rebellion his grandmother inspired was crushed, how the dolphins died and the isles were tamed and sold. His sister died fighting, his father collaborated, and he waited. For years, he worked for the very empire that had destroyed his world, rising through the diplomatic ranks, all the while harbouring his secret plan for vengeance. On world after world, he helped the Hegemony destroy indigenous life. The beautiful zeppelins of Whirl with their rainbow death agonies, the marsh centaurs of Garden, the empathic Seneschai Aluit of Hebron. And then came Brescia, where his own wife Gresha and son Alon died in the bombardment he had helped orchestrate. A miscalculation, they called it. Acceptable losses in the great game between the Hegemony and the Ousters. Finally, the Consul tells us of his ultimate betrayal, how he was sent to negotiate with the Ousters, how they revealed to him the terrible truth that the destruction of old Earth had been deliberate, orchestrated by the Technocore and the early Hegemony, how he became a triple agent, serving the Hegemony, the Ousters, and ultimately only himself and his grandmother's dream of vengeance. On Hyperion, near these very time tombs where our pilgrims now shelter, he murdered the Ouster agents and activated their device himself, starting the slow collapse of the anti-entropic fields that keep the Shrike bound to this place. Soon, perhaps very soon, the tombs will open fully, and the Shrike will be free to roam wherever it wishes. A plague on both your houses, he says, quoting an ancient play, standing as both murderer and betrayer, but still proud. The other pilgrims absorb this confession in the dancing light of the distant battle. They debate his fate, should they execute him for treason? But in the end, in a moment of profound humanity, they choose compassion. Braun Lamia embraces him, then Sol Weintraub with baby Rachel, and one by one they come together, these 6 souls bound by fate and their own requests of the Shrike. As Father Hoyt raises his hand in absolution, speaking the ancient words of forgiveness, and as the wind howls around their shelter like the voice of time itself, our pilgrims prepare for sleep. Tomorrow they will face the Shrike. Tonight they have only each other, and perhaps that's enough. The Consul, who hasn't slept easily in years, curls his fist against his cheek like a child and, surprisingly, peacefully, drifts into slumber as the wind sings its ancient lullaby around the walls of Kronos Keep. And so, dear listeners, we come to the dawn of their final journey. Picture, if you will, the Consul stirring from what may be the most peaceful sleep he's had in years. In the cold darkness before dawn, a soft, haunting melody drifts through the ancient stone corridors of Kronos Keep. Father Hoyt sits alone on the balcony, his fingers dancing across the strings of his balalaika, creating a duet with the mountain wind itself. One by one, the other pilgrims are drawn to this ethereal music. First the Consul, wrapped in his blanket against the bitter cold. Then Braun Lamia and Colonel Kassad emerge from the shadows. Sol Weintraub joins them, little Rachel in his arms, her tiny hands reaching up toward the battle-lit sky as if she could pluck those violent stars like flowers. The music grows more beautiful and strange as the wind rises with the approaching dawn. Even Martin Silenus, nursing his hangover and grumbling about the noise, cannot resist the pull of this moment. They stand together on that high balcony, 6 souls about to face their destiny, listening as the priest's music weaves with the voice of the mountain itself. As the faintest hint of dawn touches the eastern stars, they make their decision. No more waiting, no more delay. It's time. They prepare themselves carefully, you see. Each dresses in their finest, as if preparing for the most important meeting of their lives, which of course they are. Brawn in her red silk suit with black trim, Cassard in his full battle armour, black as night itself, Father Hoyt in his clerical collar and cape, the Consul in his diplomatic best, complete with his gold tricorn hat, Martin Silenus in his rippling fur coat, and Saul with Rachel nestled against his chest in her carrier. Down they go, down 661 steps, carved into the mountainside, with no railings to protect them from the abyss. Behind them, a storm gathers over the peaks, lightning crackling across glaciers and ice fields. Ahead, something extraordinary awaits. The time tombs are glowing. Each ancient structure pulses with its own distinct colour, jade green from the Sphinx, other hues from the structures deeper in the valley. This has never been recorded before, never witnessed by any previous pilgrims. The very air tastes of electricity and change. As they stand at the valley's edge, looking down into that darkness where their fate awaits, fear grips them all. But then Sol begins to sing, a simple tune from an ancient story about a journey to see a wizard. Father Hoyt joins in with his balalaika, and something magical happens. One by one, they all begin to sing this children's song from a time before time. Hand in hand they go, these 6 brave souls, no longer walking in single file, but side by side. Voices raised together against the darkness, they descend into the valley where the Shrike waits. The storm rushes toward them from behind, but they don't look back. They only look forward, singing their way into legend. And so, dear listener, our journey through the mysteries of Hyperion draws gently to a close. What a remarkable tapestry we've woven together tonight, from the Consul's lonely world to the time tombs themselves, from Father Dure's terrible discovery in the cleft, to Sol's tender vigil over little Rachel. Each story has settled into place like pieces of stained glass catching moonlight, creating something rather beautiful in the darkness. The pilgrims continue their voyage toward destiny, carrying their secrets and sorrows, their hopes and haunted memories. The Shrike waits in its thorned cathedral. Time flows backward through ancient stones, and somewhere in the vast tapestry of space and time, all these threads will weave together. But that, perhaps, is a story for another peaceful evening. For now, let these tales settle into your dreams like gentle rain on quiet leaves. Let the mysteries of Hyperion become soft shadows in your sleeping mind, the glow of the labyrinths, the whisper of Tesla trees in the wind, the eternal patience of the time tombs standing sentinel under foreign stars. If you found comfort in tonight's journey, you might consider touching that subscribe button, ever so gently, so we can share more stories together on future restful evenings. But there's no hurry, no urgency at all. Everything in its own time, as the time tombs themselves might say. Thank you for allowing me to be your companion through these tales tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder, but never worry, with mystery, but always peace. May you rest as deeply as the secrets buried in Hyperion soil, and wake refreshed like morning light breaking over the river Tethys. Sleep well, dear listener. Sweet dreams await you in the gentle darkness. Until we meet again in another story, another night. Rest peacefully. Good night.